Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, The Invitation. The village of Ashcombe Vale rested quietly beneath a pale afternoon sky, the kind of place where nothing appeared hurried and nothing seemed hidden. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the narrow lanes, and the chimneys of old stone houses released thin trails of smoke that drifted lazily into the air. It was a village that believed in manners, in tradition, and in silence. Hercule Poirot stood at the gate of Willowmere House, observing it with thoughtful interest. His immaculate coat was brushed smooth, his shoes polished to perfection, and his moustache, was arranged with mathematical precision. He had arrived not by accident, but by invitation. A curious one. The letter had come from Mrs. Lavender Holt, a woman of refined manners and delicate handwriting. She had spoken of a small family dinner and hinted, very gently, at unease beneath its pleasant surface. Such hints, Poirot knew, were rarely harmless. Inside the house, warmth greeted him. Soft lamplight glowed against pale walls, and the scent of roasted herbs drifted through the hallway. Yet something beneath that comfort felt strained, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Lavender Holt welcomed him with a thin smile. She was a woman of graceful posture, her grey hair neatly pinned, her eyes sharp despite her calm expression. "Monsieur Poirot, we are honoured," she said politely. "I trust your journey was pleasant." "Indeed, madam," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "But I sense that peace is not the true reason for my presence." Her smile faltered, only for a fraction of a second. "You are very perceptive," she said softly. Inside the drawing room stood the other guests. Edward Blake, tall and well-dressed, stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. His face was handsome but tense, as though he carried a private storm beneath his composed exterior. Beside him stood his wife, Clara Blake. She was striking in a quiet way, dark hair neatly arranged, pale skin, and eyes that held both kindness and exhaustion. There was something fragile about her, yet dignified. When she smiled at Poirot, it was warm but fleeting, as if she were conserving her strength. "My husband has told me so much about you, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. Poirot bowed again. "Only kind things, I hope." Clara smiled faintly. "He says you see what others prefer to ignore." A curious remark. Dinner was announced shortly afterward. The group gathered around the table, for souls bound by blood, marriage, and unspoken resentment. Conversation began politely enough. They spoke of the village, of the mild weather, of the roses blooming earlier than expected. Yet Poirot noticed the pauses, those brief silences where words hesitated, where glances were exchanged too quickly to be innocent. Edward spoke often, filling gaps with unnecessary charm. Mrs. Lavender listened more than she spoke. And Clara, she barely touched her food. Poirot observed everything. He noticed how Clara's hand trembled when she lifted her glass. How her eyes flicked toward her husband, then toward Mrs. Lavender, as though weighing unspoken thoughts. He noticed, too, the slight tightening of Mrs. Lavender's lips whenever Clara spoke. When dinner ended, the air felt heavier. "I think I shall step outside," Clara said suddenly. "The air in here feels rather close." Edward rose at once. "I'll come with you." "No," she replied gently. "Please. I'd like a moment alone." She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the garden. Moments passed. Poirot studied the others. Mrs. Lavender busied herself with the teacups. Edward stood near the window, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. Then, a scream. It cut through the house like shattered glass. Edward ran first. Poirot followed closely, his steps quick despite his size. They found Clara lying beside the stone bench near the fountain. Her body was still, her eyes half closed, her expression strangely peaceful. Edward dropped to his knees. "Clara! My love, no, no." Poirot knelt beside her, touching her wrist gently. There was no pulse. No wound. No sign of struggle. Only the faint scent of bitter almonds drifting through the cool air. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Poison," he murmured. The house fell into chaos. Mrs. Lavender cried out, clutching the doorway. Servants gathered, whispering prayers. Edward's grief was loud and raw, echoing across the garden. But Poirot's gaze was fixed. He saw the teacup resting on the stone bench. Empty. Too clean. He picked it up carefully, examining the rim. "Interesting," he whispered. The night deepened. The silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. A life had ended. And someone in this house had made a promise. A promise sealed with poison. Chapter 2: The House Sealed. The scream had not yet finished echoing when Ashcombe Vale began to change. Willowmere House, only an hour earlier a place of polite laughter and carefully chosen words, now felt like a stage after the curtain had dropped, chairs abandoned, lights burning too brightly, the air thick with breath and disbelief. In the garden, the fountain continued to trickle as if nothing had happened, its soft sound almost insulting in its calmness. Edward Blake remained kneeling beside his wife. His hands trembled where they hovered over Clara's still shoulders, as though he feared that touching her too firmly would make the truth permanent. His face shone with tears and sweat, his mouth half open in shock. "Clara," he whispered again and again. "My darling, please, please." Poirot stood a little apart, composed but intent. He allowed a respectful silence, because the first moments after death belonged to grief. Yet his mind was already working, arranging details like pieces on a chessboard. Mrs. Lavender Holt, pale and shaking, gripped the edge of the terrace. She made small sounds of distress, high and fragile, while her eyes moved repeatedly from Clara's body to the faces around her, as though searching for a safe expression to wear. At last, Poirot spoke. "Madam," he said gently, "we must proceed with order. There has been a crime. And until we understand it, no one should leave this house." Mrs. Lavender blinked rapidly. "A crime? Oh, Monsieur Poirot, surely it is some dreadful accident." Poirot's gaze slid to the empty teacup on the bench. Accidents do not often smell of bitter almonds. A servant, a young woman with a plain face and anxious eyes, stepped forward with hands clasped tightly. Should I fetch the doctor, sir?" "Yes," said Poirot. "And the police?" "At once." Edward's head snapped up. His eyes, red and wild, fixed on Poirot. "Police? You think someone did this? Here? In my cousin's garden?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "I think only that Madame Blake is dead, and death does not arrive without a reason. The doctor lived in the village and arrived quickly, accompanied by the constable, who was more accustomed to lost chickens than to murder. The doctor confirmed what Poirot already knew: Clara Blake had been poisoned, and the poison had worked swiftly. It could have been administered in a drink, the doctor said, or perhaps in something she ate. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Or perhaps in something she touched. The constable shifted uncomfortably. "We'll have to ask questions, sir. Everyone present." Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone did not. "Indeed. But before that, we must ensure nothing is disturbed." He turned towards the house. "Madame Lavender, I request that all cups, plates, glasses, everything used this evening, be gathered and kept safe. No washing. No clearing away. Mrs. Lavender's lips parted, her breath catching slightly. Of course. Naturally. Poirot noticed the pause, the smallest tremor of reluctance. It lasted only a second. But Poirot did not miss seconds. Inside, the servants moved about like frightened mice. Candles flickered. Curtains fluttered gently from a window left half open. The drawing room, which had earlier seemed warm and respectable, now looked like a place where secrets had been politely arranged on the furniture. Poirot sat at the long dining table with the constable and doctor, while the remaining guests stood nearby. Edward refused to sit. He paced, hands clenching and unclenching. "Tell them," Edward demanded suddenly, pointing toward Mrs. Lavender. "Tell them Clara was happy. Tell them she had no enemies." Clara had no enemies, Poirot thought. But she may have had a truth. Poirot folded his hands neatly. "Monsieur Blake, at what time did your wife go into the garden?" Edward's breath hitched. "After dessert. She said the room felt close. She wanted air. And you did not follow her." "She asked me not to." Poirot nodded. "You obeyed." The word landed softly but carried weight. Edward stiffened. Poirot continued. "Madame Lavender, did anyone else go into the garden after dinner?" Mrs. Lavender's eyes widened. "No. No, I don't believe so." Poirot let the silence stretch, just enough to make people feel its pressure. "Belief is not the same as certainty, madam." The young servant, Mary, as she was called, spoke in a trembling voice. "I saw Mrs. Holt go to the kitchen, sir. She said she needed more sugar for the tea." Mrs. Lavender's head turned sharply. "Mary! Must you speak at such a time?" Mary flushed, then lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, Poirot's voice remained mild. "No, no. It is quite right. Truth does not wait for comfort." He turned to Mary. "You served the tea?" "Yes, monsieur." "Did you pour it at the table?" Mary nodded. "Yes." "Each cup?" Poirot looked at Mrs. Lavender. "And did you touch any cup after it was poured?" Mrs. Lavender lifted her chin. "Certainly not." "Why would I?" Poirot's eye softened again, almost kind. "Because people do not always act with reason, madam. Sometimes they act with fear." Edward's pacing grew faster. "This is madness," he muttered. "Pure madness." Poirot watched him quietly. Edward's distress felt real, but Poirot had seen real distress used as disguise before. Grief could be honest, and still be useful. "Tell me," Poirot said, "who prepared the dessert?" Mary answered. "Cook did, sir. But Mrs. Holt asked for the fruit platter to be arranged a certain way. She is particular." Mrs. Lavender gave a weak laugh that did not sound like laughter. "I like things tidy." "Is that now a crime?" Poirot did not respond immediately. He took out a small handkerchief, dabbed at his forehead with delicate care, and then asked, "Madame Blake's teacup, was it her own? Did she choose it?" Edward blinked. "Her own?" "She simply used what was placed before her." Poirot nodded slowly. "And she drank it in the garden." Edward's voice broke. "Yes. She took it with her. She said she wanted to enjoy it outside." Poirot's eyes shifted to Mary. "Did you see her take it?" "Yes, monsieur. She carried it carefully, like she didn't want to spill." Poirot rose, smoothing his coat. "Then we will examine the cup." They returned to the garden bench. The teacup still sat where it had been, guarded by the constable as though it might suddenly grow legs and escape. Poirot leaned closer, sniffing gently. No tea remained. But the faint almond scent still lingered, most strongly at the rim. Poirot turned the cup slowly in his gloved hands. A thin shine caught the light, not water, not tea, but something oily. He murmured. The doctor peered. What is it? Poirot did not answer at once. He looked instead at the bench, at the stone surface, at the position of the cup, and at the fountain nearby. Then he noticed something else, a handkerchief, white, neatly folded, tucked just beneath the edge of the bench, as though it had been pushed there deliberately. He lifted it with the tip of his fingers. A faint floral scent clung to it, and something bitter beneath. Edward stared. That isn't mine. Mrs. Lavender's face had gone even paler. I have many handkerchiefs. Poirot's eyes remained unreadable. Yes, madam. Many people do. He returned to the others and spoke gently, but with authority. This house is now sealed. No one leaves. No one sends letters. No one whispers in corners. We will speak openly, because the dead deserve that much. Edward stepped forward, voice shaking with rage. If someone did this, if someone killed my wife. Poirot raised a hand. Then we will find them. But we will not find them by shouting. We will find them by thinking. He looked from face to face. In each expression, grief, shock, fear, he saw something different. Not one of them was simply innocent. All of them carried a hidden weight. And Poirot knew, with a certainty that settled like cold iron in his chest, that Clara Blake had not died by chance. She had gone into that garden with something on her mind. Perhaps a confession. Perhaps a confrontation. Perhaps a promise. And somewhere inside Willowmere House, someone was already preparing their next lie. Chapter 3, The Faces Behind the Smile. Morning arrived slowly at Willowmere House, as though the sun itself hesitated to look upon what had occurred. Pale light filtered through the tall windows, touching the furniture without warmth. The air felt heavy, weighted by unslept hours and unspoken truths. Hercule Poirot had not slept. He sat alone in the drawing-room, seated upright in an armchair, his hands folded neatly over his walking stick. His eyes, though tired, were sharp with thought. The night had given him much to consider, small details that whispered rather than shouted. Footsteps approached softly. Edward Blake entered the room, his face hollow, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He looked older than he had the night before, as though grief had added years in a single night. Monsieur Poirot, he said quietly. They told me you wished to speak with me. Yes, Monsieur Blake. Please, sit. Edward obeyed, lowering himself onto the edge of a chair. He clasped his hands together, then unclasped them again. I cannot believe she is gone, he murmured. One moment she was beside me, the next, his voice broke. Poirot observed him carefully. Grief, when genuine, had a certain disorder to it. Edward's sorrow was deep, but there was also restraint, a man fighting to remain in control. Tell me about your wife, Poirot said gently. Edward swallowed. Clara was thoughtful. Kind. She noticed things others ignored. Sometimes I think she understood people better than they understood themselves. Did she fear anyone in this house? Edward hesitated. No. Not fear. But she was uneasy. About what? Edward stared at the floor. She had discovered something. Something about my cousin. Poirot's eyes sharpened. About Madame Lavender. Edward nodded. Clara came across papers, old accounts, letters. She said money had gone missing years ago, quietly. Small amounts. Enough to escape notice. And what did she intend to do with this knowledge? She wanted to speak to my cousin privately. She believed people deserved a chance to explain themselves. Poirot sighed softly. A noble instinct. Sometimes a dangerous one. Edward's jaw tightened. You think my cousin killed her? Poirot did not answer directly. I think your cousin feared something. Edward looked up sharply. Feared exposure? Perhaps, Poirot replied. Or perhaps something worse. A knock interrupted them. Mary, the young servant, stood at the door, pale and hesitant. Monsieur Poirot. Mrs. Holt wishes to speak with you. Of course, Poirot said calmly. I will come. Mrs. Lavender Holt sat in the small morning room, hands folded in her lap. She wore a dark shawl, though the room was warm. Her posture was upright, composed, but something about her eyes betrayed fatigue deeper than a sleepless night. Monsieur Poirot, she said softly, you believe I am capable of murder. Poirot inclined his head slightly. I believe everyone is capable of something, madam, under the right pressure. She gave a sad smile. That is a dangerous belief. It is also a true one. She looked toward the window. Clara was a dear girl. Too gentle for this world. She saw good where others saw convenience. Did she confront you last night? Mrs. Lavender hesitated. Only a moment, but enough. She spoke to me, she admitted. She said she knew about the accounts. She asked if I had made a mistake or if there was something I wished to explain. And what did you tell her? I told her she did not understand. Her voice trembled. I told her to leave matters alone. Poirot nodded slowly. Did she believe you? Mrs. Lavender closed her eyes. I do not know. Silence stretched between them. Poirot spoke again, softly. Madam, you are a woman of intelligence. You know that poison requires planning. She opened her eyes. Are you accusing me? I am observing you. Her lips pressed together. Then observe this, I loved my cousin. I would never harm her. Poirot rose. Love can be a complicated thing. Later that morning, Poirot requested to speak with Mary again. The young servant stood stiffly in the corridor, twisting her apron. You were fond of Madame Blake, were you not? He asked gently. Mary nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. She was kind. She spoke to me like I mattered. Did she say anything unusual yesterday? Mary hesitated. She asked me if I ever felt trapped. If I ever wanted to run away. Poirot tilted his head. And what did you say? I told her everyone wants to run sometimes. Poirot smiled faintly. And did she say why she asked? No, sir. Only that some promises are heavier than chains. That phrase lingered in the air. Poirot thanked her and walked slowly toward the garden. The bench where Clara had died remained untouched. The morning light revealed details hidden in darkness, a faint scuff near the stone edge, a mark where someone had stood very still for a long time. He knelt and examined the ground. There, half concealed beneath fallen leaves, lay a thin fragment of paper, burnt at the edge. Carefully, he lifted it. Only 3 words remained legible. I will tell. Poirot closed his eyes. So, he murmured, you had decided. Footsteps approached behind him. It was Edward. You found something, Edward said. Yes, Poirot replied quietly. A voice that was almost heard. Edward swallowed. She was going to expose someone. Yes. And that frightened them enough to kill her. Poirot stood slowly. Perhaps. Or perhaps it frightened them enough to make a terrible mistake. Edward's hands clenched. Then tell me, Monsieur Poirot, who did this? Poirot looked at him steadily. I am not yet certain, he said. But I am close. Very close. He glanced back toward the house, where behind closed doors, secrets waited patiently. The truth, he added softly, has a way of revealing itself, especially when someone tries too hard to bury it. Chapter 4: The Weight of Secrets. The rain began in the early afternoon, light at first, then steady, tapping gently against the tall windows of Willowmere House. It softened the air but did nothing to ease the tension within. The house seemed to shrink beneath its weight, as though its walls were listening. Hercule Poirot stood by the window of the small study, hands folded behind his back, watching thin trails of rain slide down the glass. Outside, the garden looked peaceful, too peaceful. The bench where Clara Blake had died now appeared innocent, almost inviting. But Poirot knew better. Truth did not vanish with daylight. Behind him, the door creaked softly. Monsieur Poirot, said Edward Blake. You asked to see me again. Yes, thank you for coming, Poirot replied, turning slowly. Please, sit. Edward obeyed, though his movements were stiff. There was a hollowness to him now, as though grief had drained something essential. I want to speak to you, Poirot began gently, not as a suspect, but as a husband. Edward swallowed. I don't know how much more I can say. Then say what you can. There was a long pause. She was different these past weeks, Edward said at last. Distracted. Thoughtful. Sometimes, frightened. Did she tell you why? No. But she was writing letters. Burning them afterwards. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Burning them? Yes. I once caught her in the garden with a letter half burned. She said it was nothing important. And did you believe her? Edward's lips tightened. I wanted to. Poirot nodded slowly. Often, monsieur, we choose belief because the truth demands courage. Edward looked down at his hands. She loved honesty. Almost too much. She said lies rot people from the inside. Poirot studied him carefully. Did she ever accuse you of dishonesty? Edward flinched. She suspected something from before our marriage. Old debts. Poor decisions. I told her I had corrected everything. Had you? Edward did not answer. Poirot rose. Thank you. That will be all, for now. When Edward had gone, Poirot remained still, listening to the rain. Every word, every hesitation, formed a pattern. Not yet a picture, but a frame. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested to speak with Mrs. Lavender again. She received him in the small library, where shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls. A fire burned low, casting gentle shadows. You are persistent, Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly. I am thorough, he replied. She gestured for him to sit. You think I killed Clara? I think you were afraid of her. Mrs. Lavender's mouth tightened. She threatened to ruin me. Did she? She believed she had uncovered financial misconduct. She did not understand the arrangements I had made. It was not theft, it was survival. Poirot tilted his head. And yet, you did not deny taking the money. Mrs. Lavender exhaled slowly. The estate was failing. I borrowed from one account to save another. I always intended to repay it. And Clara discovered this? Yes. And what did she say? She said she would tell Edward. She said he deserved honesty. Poirot nodded. A dangerous devotion. Mrs. Lavender's eyes glistened. I begged her to wait. To give me time. She refused. Silence fell between them. Poirot spoke gently, And then? She went into the garden. Poirot studied her face. Did you follow her? No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Poirot leaned forward. Madam, fear makes us careless. You are intelligent. But last night, something slipped. She stiffened. You went to the kitchen, Poirot continued. You asked for sugar. You had access to the cups. Her breath hitched. You knew which cup was hers, he added softly. You had watched her habits for years. Mrs. Lavender rose abruptly. I did not poison her. Poirot remained calm. I did not say you did. She turned away, pressing her hands against the mantel. I loved her. Like a daughter. Love and fear often share the same bed, Poirot said quietly. She did not answer. Later, Poirot wandered the corridors alone. The house seemed to breathe around him, filled with echoes of conversations long finished. He entered the small writing room where Clara had spent her final afternoon. The desk remained untouched, a blotter neatly arranged, a pen resting beside an empty ink bottle. Poirot examined the drawer. Inside, he found a folded paper, tucked beneath a ledger. It was a list. Names. Dates. Amounts of money. And at the bottom, written in a delicate hand. I cannot allow this to continue. Poirot closed his eyes. So, he murmured, you were preparing to act. A soft sound came from the doorway. Mary stood there, pale and anxious. I didn't mean to spy, she whispered. But I heard voices. Poirot smiled gently. Come in, my child. You have nothing to fear. She stepped inside slowly. I saw Mrs. Holt late last night. She was in the garden. Poirot's gaze sharpened. When? After dinner. I was clearing the dishes. She walked very fast, like she didn't want to be seen. Did she carry anything? Mary hesitated. A handkerchief. White. Poirot nodded slowly. Thank you. You have been very brave. As Mary left, Poirot stood alone once more. Everything was beginning to align, too neatly, perhaps. The motive. The opportunity. The fear. And yet, something disturbed him. Mrs. Lavender's fear was real, but fear alone did not explain the careful placement of the cup. Nor did it explain the deliberate calm with which the scene had been arranged. Someone else had been thinking. Planning. Someone who understood timing. Someone who knew how guilt could be directed. Poirot gazed out the window as the rain softened into mist. There is another hand in this, he murmured. I am certain of it. And somewhere within Willowmere House, that hand waited, quietly confident that it had not yet been seen. Chapter 5: The Weight of Guilt. The rain had stopped, but the house still felt drenched in unease. A dull grey light filtered through the windows, settling heavily upon the furniture, the walls, the very air itself. Willowmere no longer felt like a home, it felt like a witness. Hercule Poirot stood near the hearth, warming his hands though the fire had long since died. He had learned that stillness invited truth. People, when left with their thoughts, often betrayed themselves. The silence was broken by hurried footsteps. Edward Blake entered the room, his face pale, his movements tense and unsteady. Monsieur Poirot, he said hoarsely. I must speak with you. Now. Poirot turned calmly. Of course, monsieur. Please sit. Edward did not sit. He paced instead, rubbing his hands together as if trying to scrub away an invisible stain. I cannot live like this, he said. Everyone looking at me. Whispering. Thinking. Poirot watched him closely. Thinking what? That I killed my wife. Poirot said nothing. Edward stopped pacing and faced him. Perhaps I deserve it. The words hung in the air. Poirot's brow lifted slightly. That is a heavy statement. Edward laughed bitterly. You don't know what I've done. What I've hidden. Poirot gestured gently toward the chair. Then sit and tell me. Edward obeyed at last. His shoulders sagged as though a great weight had finally pressed him down. I lied to her, he said quietly. For years. About money. About debts. About who I truly was. Poirot nodded slowly. I borrowed. I gambled. I lost more than I could repay. My cousin helped me once, then twice. But the third time, she refused. His voice cracked. Clara found the letters. She confronted me. She said she would tell the family. And you feared what would happen, Poirot said softly. I feared losing her, Edward whispered. And my name. And everything. He buried his face in his hands. I never meant for her to die. Poirot remained still. Did you poison her? Edward looked up sharply. No. Never. Then what did you do? Edward hesitated, then spoke through clenched teeth. I tampered with the tea. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Explain. I added something harmless. A bitter herbal tincture. I wanted to make her ill enough to delay her. To buy time. Nothing more. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And how do you know it was harmless? Edward swallowed. Because I had used it before. On myself. Where did you obtain it? From the cupboard in the study. Old remedies. My aunt kept them. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. You altered the cup. Yes, Edward whispered. But I did not kill her. A long silence followed. Poirot finally spoke. Monsieur Blake, your confession explains much. But not everything. Edward's voice trembled. Then I will go to the police. I will confess to everything. Poirot raised a hand. Not yet. Edward stared. Why not? Because you are not the murderer. Edward blinked. You believe me. I believe you tampered with the cup, Poirot said calmly. But not with poison. Edward sagged back in his chair, tears streaming freely now. But then, who did? Poirot did not answer immediately. Later that afternoon, Poirot asked to speak with Mary once more. The young woman stood nervously by the door, twisting her apron. You saw Mr. Blake in the kitchen last night? Poirot asked gently. Yes, sir. What was he doing? He was standing by the cupboard. He looked frightened. Poirot nodded. And did you see anyone else enter the kitchen afterward? Mary hesitated. I think so. Mrs. Holt passed through. She said she was looking for a cloth. Poirot thanked her and dismissed her kindly. As she left, Poirot's eyes drifted toward the corridor beyond. The pieces were aligning, but one was still missing. That evening, the house grew eerily quiet. Mrs. Lavender did not come to dinner. Concerned, Poirot went to her room. He knocked once. Then again. No answer. He opened the door. Mrs. Lavender sat at her writing desk, hands folded neatly before her. Her eyes were closed, her face calm. For one dreadful moment, Poirot feared the worst. But she was breathing. On the desk lay a folded letter. Poirot read it carefully. I cannot live under this weight any longer. I did not mean for Clara to die. I only meant to frighten her. The poison was never meant to be fatal. I do not know how it became so. I will face what I have done." Poirot exhaled slowly. She had tried to confess, yet something was wrong. The poison used was rare. Precise. Not something one stumbled upon. He turned toward the shelf behind her desk. A small glass vial was missing. And suddenly, everything shifted. Poirot understood. This was not a crime born solely of fear. It was a crime shaped by opportunity, guided by knowledge, and sharpened by someone who knew exactly how far to push another into guilt. Someone who had allowed others to believe themselves responsible. Someone who had watched quietly. And smiled. Poirot straightened. "The truth," he murmured, "is very nearly ready to speak." Outside, the wind rose again, brushing the windows like whispering fingers. And somewhere within Willowmere House, the true murderer waited, certain that suspicion had finally settled elsewhere. Chapter 6: The Hand Behind the Curtain. The night settled heavily over Willowmere House, thick with silence and unanswered thoughts. The lamps burned low, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the walls like quiet accusations. Somewhere within the house, a clock ticked steadily, each second marking the narrowing distance between truth and exposure. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the drawing room, his reflection faintly visible in the darkened window. His thoughts moved carefully, precisely, like pieces being placed upon a chessboard. The pattern was nearly complete. Yet one move remained hidden. He turned as footsteps approached. Mrs. Lavender Holt stood in the doorway, pale but composed. Her eyes were tired, yet strangely clear. "You wish to see me, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. "Yes," he replied softly. "Please, come in." She entered and sat, folding her hands in her lap. "I assume this is about my letter." "In part," Poirot said. "But more about what was not written." She stiffened slightly. "You see," Poirot continued, "your letter speaks of guilt, of regret, of fear. But it does not speak of opportunity." Her gaze flickered. "You are a careful woman, madam. You do not act impulsively. And yet, the events of that night required precision. Timing. Knowledge." She remained silent. "You knew Clara was troubled," Poirot went on. "You knew she had uncovered irregularities in the accounts. And yes, you feared exposure. But fear alone does not create poison." Her fingers tightened together. "You did not prepare the poison," Poirot said quietly. "You only believed you did." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone else guided your fear. Someone who knew you well. Someone who placed the idea in your mind, then stepped back." Her breath caught. "You are wrong." "Am I?" Poirot asked gently. "Think carefully. Who spoke to you before the dinner? Who mentioned consequences? Who reminded you what you stood to lose?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. Poirot watched her closely. Someone who spoke with concern. With sympathy. Someone who made you feel safe. Her voice trembled. "Edward." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes. Edward Blake." Her face drained of color. "He came to you in distress," Poirot continued. "He spoke of shame, of debts, of his wife discovering his past. He made you believe that Clara would destroy not only him, but you as well." Mrs. Lavender pressed her hands to her mouth. "He said she would ruin us both." "And so," Poirot said softly, "you began to fear her. Fear enough to consider stopping her." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I never meant to harm her. I only wanted to scare her. I asked Edward what to use." He said there was something mild in the cupboard, just enough to frighten her. Poirot's eyes darkened. And he knew exactly what it was. She looked up sharply. You mean? He replaced it, Poirot finished. Long before that night. Her breath caught in a sob. No, he loved her. Poirot's voice was gentle, but firm. Love does not always prevent cruelty, madam. Sometimes it sharpens it. Silence fell between them, heavy and absolute. At last, Mrs. Lavender whispered, I never touched the cup. I was too afraid. I couldn't do it. I know, Poirot said quietly. She looked at him with wide eyes. Then who? Edward did. Later that evening, Poirot summoned Edward to the drawing room. The man arrived pale, his expression already defensive. You know, Edward said tightly. Don't you? Poirot regarded him calmly. Yes. Edward let out a shaky breath. Then say it. You orchestrated it, Poirot said. You planted the poison. You allowed others to believe themselves responsible. Edward laughed softly, hollowly. Clever. Very clever. You counted on guilt, Poirot continued. On fear. You knew your cousin would blame herself. You knew Mrs. Lavender would unravel. Edward's smile faltered. She was going to expose me. And so you silenced her, Poirot replied. Edward's voice broke. I loved her. Perhaps, Poirot said. But you loved yourself more. Edward's composure cracked. His shoulders sagged. She gave me no choice, he whispered. I begged her. I told her I would fix everything. She wouldn't listen. You could have walked away, Poirot said. And lose everything. Edward's eyes burned. No. I chose to survive. Poirot studied him sadly. At the cost of her life. Edward sank into a chair, his face in his hands. She drank the tea so calmly, he whispered. She even smiled. Poirot felt the weight of that moment settle deep within him. She trusted you, he said quietly. Edward said nothing more. The authorities arrived before dawn. Edward offered no resistance. As he was led away, he glanced once toward the stairs, where Clara had once stood smiling, unaware of the danger so close to her heart. Mrs. Lavender wept openly, her guilt no longer hidden. Poirot stood alone in the drawing room, the fire long extinguished. Justice, he knew, was never clean. Only necessary. Yet something lingered, an echo of sadness, of wasted love and silent warnings ignored. He adjusted his tie, preparing to leave. But the case was not yet finished. For there remained one question still unanswered. How had Edward known exactly when to act? And who, if anyone, had helped him prepare the poison? The truth, Poirot knew, was never simple. And the final thread had yet to be pulled. Chapter 7, The Final Silence. The night after Edward Blake's arrest felt unnaturally still. Willowmere House no longer echoed with whispered fears or hurried footsteps. Instead, it lay wrapped in a heavy quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rain whispered against the windows again, soft and unhurried, like a slow confession. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the drawing room, the fire glowing faintly before him. His reflection shimmered in the polished surface of the mantel clock, distorted and thoughtful. The arrest should have brought clarity. Instead, something gnawed at him. Edward Blake had confessed, but his confession was too neat. Too complete. A man in true panic rarely constructed such an elegant explanation. There had been emotion, yes. Desperation, certainly. But also something calculated. Poirot rose and crossed the room slowly. Truth, he knew, was often layered. And sometimes the most dangerous lies were the ones people told themselves. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Poirot said. Mary entered quietly, her face pale, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. I couldn't sleep," she said. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Blake. About what she said to me." Poirot gestured for her to sit. "Tell me." She said she was afraid of making the wrong choice. That doing the right thing sometimes destroys people. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Did she say who would be destroyed?" Mary shook her head. "No. But she cried. I had never seen her cry before." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Thank you, Mary," he said gently. "You may go." When she left, Poirot returned to the window. The garden lay silvered beneath moonlight. The bench where Clara had died stood stark and accusing. He whispered, "You were not afraid of death, my dear. You were afraid of betrayal." Footsteps echoed again, but heavier this time. Mrs. Lavender Holt entered slowly, her face pale, her eyes hollow. "I cannot sleep," she said. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her." Poirot inclined his head. "Guilt does that." She flinched. "I never touched the poison." "I know," Poirot replied gently. She sank into a chair. "Then why does it feel like my hands are stained?" "Because you were used," Poirot said quietly. "And because you loved her." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Edward manipulated me. He planted fear in my mind, then waited for it to grow." "Yes," Poirot said. "Fear is a powerful tool." Mrs. Lavender stared at him. "Then why do I still feel that something is missing?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and walked toward the door. "Come with me," he said. They moved through the darkened corridors until they reached the small study. Poirot lit a lamp. Its glow revealed the desk where Clara had once written her final thoughts. Poirot opened the drawer and removed the folded paper he had found earlier. "Tell me," he said softly, "what do you see?" Mrs. Lavender leaned forward. "It's a list. Names. Numbers." "Yes." "And what do they mean?" Her eyes widened. "They're transactions. Payments. Transfers." "Exactly." She looked at him, confused. "But Edward was not the only one involved," Poirot finished. Her breath caught. "You think someone else was stealing?" "I think," Poirot said gently, "that Clara discovered a larger truth. One that did not begin or end with Edward." Mrs. Lavender sank into the chair. "No." Poirot's voice was calm but firm. "There were others benefiting from those accounts. People who ensured the estate remained profitable, at a moral cost." She looked up sharply. "You mean?" "Someone who stood close enough to guide events. Someone who could move freely through the house without suspicion." A shadow passed over her face. "You mean me?" Poirot nodded slowly. Tears spilled freely now. "I never took much. Only enough to survive. I told myself it was temporary. And when Clara discovered it," Poirot said softly, "you panicked." "I never wanted her dead," she whispered. "I only wanted her silent." Poirot sighed. "And Edward gave you the means." She covered her face. "He told me it was harmless. He said it would only frighten her. But he lied." She nodded. "Because he needed her dead," Poirot continued. "And he needed someone else to carry the guilt." The room fell silent. After a long moment, Mrs. Lavender whispered. "I didn't kill her, but I killed her all the same." Poirot stepped closer. Responsibility is not always measured by the hand that acts. She looked at him, broken. "What will happen now?" "The truth will be told," he said gently. "That is all justice can promise." Later that night, Poirot stood alone in the garden. The air was cool, the sky clear. The bench gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Footsteps approached behind him. "I knew I'd find you here," came Edward's voice. Poirot did not turn. "You always liked the quiet places." Edward sighed. "You're going to expose everything." "Yes." Edward laughed bitterly. "I almost admire you." Poirot turned at last. "You admired yourself enough for both of us." Edward's expression hardened. "She was going to destroy me." "She was trying to save others," Poirot replied. "There is a difference." Edward looked away. "I loved her." Poirot's voice softened. "Love does not kill. Fear does." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Edward straightened. "Do what you must." Poirot nodded. "I will." As Edward turned to leave, Poirot added quietly, "The truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how deep it is buried." Edward paused, but did not look back. When he was gone, Poirot remained standing beneath the moon. The final truth was now fully formed. Only one thing remained: to speak it aloud. Chapter 8: The Truth Revealed. Morning arrived quietly at Willowmere House, as though the night itself wished to slip away unnoticed. Pale light crept through the tall windows, touching the walls with hesitant warmth. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in every corner of the house. Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing-room, perfectly composed, his hands folded behind his back. The furniture had been rearranged, chairs drawn into a semicircle, the space prepared not for comfort, but for truth. One by one, they arrived. Mrs. Lavender entered first, her face pale yet resolute. Mary followed, eyes wide and uncertain. Then came Edward Blake, escorted by the local constable, his posture stiff but dignified. He did not resist. He seemed almost relieved. When all were seated, Poirot cleared his throat softly. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "thank you for gathering. What I must say is not easy, but it is necessary." Silence answered him. "We are here because Clara Blake is dead," Poirot continued. "And because her death was not an accident." Edward closed his eyes. Poirot stepped forward. "Before I explain how she died, we must understand why." He turned toward Mrs. Lavender. "Madam, you were afraid. Afraid that Clara would expose your financial misconduct. You feared disgrace, perhaps ruin." Mrs. Lavender nodded, tears slipping freely now. "Yes. You confronted her," Poirot went on. "And in your fear, you considered silencing her, if only temporarily. You believed you were capable of frightening her into silence." "I never wanted her dead," she whispered. "I know," Poirot replied gently. "You sought something mild. Something to delay her. But you did not understand what you were truly handling." He turned slowly toward Edward. "You, Monsieur Blake, understood it perfectly." Edward stiffened. "You knew the properties of the substance. You knew it could kill. And you knew how to make it appear as though someone else had done it." Edward said nothing. "You used your wife's love against her," Poirot continued. "You exploited her kindness. And you allowed others to believe they were responsible for her death." Edward's voice cracked. "I never meant." Poirot raised a hand. "Intentions do not erase actions." He walked to the center of the room. "Let us speak plainly," he said. Clara Blake discovered a pattern of deception, money moved, records altered, trust abused. She believed honesty could save what remained of her family. She was wrong. He paused. You learned of her intentions and acted swiftly. You replaced the harmless substance with poison. You knew she would take the cup outside. You knew she trusted you. Edward's breathing grew shallow. And when she died, Poirot continued, you allowed others to shoulder the blame. Mrs. Lavender believed herself responsible. You encouraged her fear. You watched her suffer in silence. Tears streamed down Edward's face now. I loved her, he whispered. Poirot's voice softened. Perhaps. But love without conscience becomes possession. The room fell into stillness. At last, Edward spoke again. I thought I could control it. I thought I could survive it. You misjudged, Poirot replied. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when built on pain. Edward bowed his head. I did it, he said quietly. I killed her. The words seemed to echo against the walls. The constable stepped forward. Edward did not resist as he was gently taken by the arm. Before leaving, he turned back once. Tell her, he said to Poirot. Tell her I loved her. Poirot nodded solemnly. When Edward was gone, silence filled the room once more. Mrs. Lavender sank into her chair, broken. I helped him, she whispered. Even if I didn't know how far it would go. Poirot looked at her kindly. You will have to answer for that, madam. But remorse is not meaningless. She nodded, tears falling freely. The constable escorted her away. Only Poirot remained. He moved slowly toward the window, gazing out into the garden where Clara had taken her final breath. The morning sun now bathed the bench in gold, transforming it from a place of death into one of quiet remembrance. Mary approached softly. Is it over, sir? Poirot considered the question. Justice has spoken, he said at last. But endings are rarely clean. She nodded. As the house emptied, Poirot lingered alone. He thought of Clara, her courage, her honesty, her quiet resolve. She had believed in truth, even when it cost her everything. Poirot straightened his jacket and adjusted his moustache with care. The world, he murmured, is often unkind to those who choose honesty. But it is only through such souls that light enters. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, washing Willowmere House in warmth. The shadows retreated. And though the past could not be undone, its secrets had finally been laid to rest.